i-reliance yethu on these tools, has it also not created a paralysis?
It has.
Because there's no revolution which is going to happen according to our wishes, then it's not a revolution. It must be discomforting, it must be unsettling. You understand?
Sure.
So akho convenience kwi-revolution uba andikwazi ukukufowunela okanye my data is finished.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me quickly tackle it here while my connection is looking okay so far. I don't know if you can hear me. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we are free.
Oh, okay. As Lumis has already stated, that this is part 2 of our dialogue that we had in 2019. So we have to continue to expand the conversation within ourselves and then to the masses. So the pillars that maintain the idea of South Africa, we already know that are built and sustained on the crimes of invasion, dispossession, and the conquest of Africans. It is so much that the self-concept of Africans in South Africa, even at times of a supposed democracy, are defined along the lines of whiteness and everything that Black is not. So we have to continue. We continue to exist as the other of humanness and socially dead. So even that, our stand and resistance as a people continue to be reduced to an act of tribalism or hooliganism or even party politics. So even so, as us, the children of Biko in post-1994 South Africa, we have come to realize that perhaps we need to get the message to the masses. The masses need an inward-looking process so they understand who we are outside of the world as we know it. So it is us that have to. It is for this purpose that we have started these conversations on Black consciousness, because it is when we continue speak of our conditions that we become tired and begin to imagine a world outside of the world that we know. So, comrades, as we should now be understanding that it is us that can change the narrative. Because even if we had everything that the white man has, our bodies will continue to be images of criminality and everything less than a human being. Just as we said now, our connections will be cut off, our families will be broken apart. There are many ways, like the lockdown will tell you that you cannot visit your family because of that, you cannot do this because of this, we cannot form gatherings because of this. But gatherings are important for us to continue these conversations. Because now, if a revolution is beginning and people are not aware of a world after the revolution, then we have not realized the dream of Black consciousness. So today, as we expand the conversation, we continue to relate our reality to Black consciousness. So the conversation should never end with us, the children of radical scholars, but the masses and those who consider themselves revolutionaries. Therefore, we will continue to have public dialogues like this, have seminars, webinars, and all sorts. So the purpose here is that we have to arm our warriors. We have to arm our ground forces with not only the physical weapons, but the mental capacity, so we can all together carry the flag of Azania forward when our leaders fall behind. So to help us unpack and expand the conversation, as comrades, we are joined today by Veli Mbele, So he will give us the historiographical outline of Black consciousness. Veli is an Afrocentric essayist, a lover of jazz and soul music, who loves with positive-minded Black people. He is also a co-founder of the Black Power Front and an online Afrocentric channel, Babiza Mutaba. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly. We are also joined by Thando Sipuye, who will be expanding and continuing from the outline given to us by Veli. He will be speaking on Black consciousness as a philosophy for resistance, liberation, and revolution. So Thando is an African-centered historian. He is a writer, he is a social scientist who is a multimedia and communications professional. He is also an executive member of the ANC Foundation and Afrocentric Study Group. So those will be our speakers today, who will obviously educate us, including myself and everybody out there, on the relevance and of Black space. Not Black space, Black consciousness. So, comrades, the ground is fertile. The revolution has always been upon us. So when a moment presents itself, we must be ready to take up our arms and be aware of enemy lines, so that we know where we're going as a people, or where do we desire to be as a people. So by the end of this dialogue, we are hoping that we can all begin to ask the right questions to the right people and understand, or at least begin to understand, the relevance of Black consciousness in post-1994 South Africa. At this point, I would be giving it over to Ulebo, but it seems that he is not with us at the moment. So I will then hand it back to Ndumiso. Ndumiso later.
I thank you, Comrade Andile. As Wandile has said now, this is part 2 of a dialogue that we had in 2019 on the relevance of Black consciousness in post-94 South Africa. So without wasting any time, let me just hand over to Veli, who will be talking about the evolution of Black consciousness resistance.
Yes, a peace and Black power.
Black power.
Okay, no. Diavakala, ne?
Yes, Dad.
All right. Mandi bulele to Black Space, Put Andile, Put Ndumi, and all persons are involved with Black Space. And to just start by saying, Black Space is doing very brilliant and inspiring work. You know, I continue to follow umsebenzi owenziwa yi-Black Space, and it inspires me a lot, you know, especially landing now amandla. And so it is something that I really appreciate in yenzayo with Black Space. Well, I greet you also in the names of our ancestors, right? Whose bodies were violently snatched from Africa and scattered all over the world like worthless grain, whose bodies were thrown off the slave ships and were fed to sharks for sport. They whose bodies were burned beyond the limit, wrapped around trees like paper, and had their flesh ripped from their bodies by the whips of the slave masters. We have been requested to speak on the topic, as you have correctly said, the relevance of Black consciousness in post-1994 South Africa. You know, I was thinking about what is post-1994 South Africa. You know, I don't know if it's a topic on its own. Why is this, you know, 1994 so important? And mhlambi ucwanini will help us to understand in 1994, so that there's also post, you know, and are we really post 1994, right? So those were just my thoughts. In my view, what we refer to as Black consciousness, Pan-Africanism, Afrocentricity, African or Black nationalism, right, are essentially interrelated responses of the Black world to externally created conditions of oppression in their various manifestations. Understood in this sense, at a fundamental level, Black consciousness addresses itself to the nature of Black being globally, and it seeks to help Black people resolve questions relating to, amongst others, phenomenology, the systematic reflection on and the study of structures of consciousness, ontology, the structure of nature or the nature of reality and being, epistemology, the study of the nature and the scope of knowledge, historiography, the philosophy or theory of writing history, and liberation theory and praxis, a theoretical framework that grapples with the question, how do we change our reality? So I am going to look at Black consciousness more as liberation theory and praxis, right? So, and the central thesis of my presentation is that Black consciousness as liberation theory and praxis has been in existence for as long as Black people have been engaged in wars of liberation against foreign invasion and slavery. For purposes of this conversation, I propose to look at the topic, right, just through three questions. So the first question is important moments of Black radical resistance that occurred in the month of July. That is the month we are in now. And then number two, I will look at slave rebellions as manifestations of Black consciousness. And I will conclude with a set of key observations. The month of July, right? Some of the key moments in the history of Black radical resistance are the following. The anniversary of the passing of one of the preeminent Afrocentric scholars, John Henry Clarke, on the 16th of July, 1998. The 16th of July also marks the 74th anniversary of the birth of that warrior queen, the former Black Panther warrior and Black Liberation Army warrior, Mama Aluk Bala Shakur, who is in Cuba, in exile, as we know. It also marks the 74th anniversary of one of the leading African nationalist theoreticians, the first president of the ANC Youth League, Ubaba Umuziwa Mbele. But it also marks the 96th anniversary of the birth of two of the most iconic figures in Black radical resistance, Patrice Lumumba and Frantz Fanon. The interesting thing about Lumumba and Fanon is that not only were they friends, right? They met through Kwame Nkrumah in 1958 in Ghana. They were born in the same year, 1925, and died in the same year, 1961. You know, Fanon died, you know, after Lumumba, several weeks after Lumumba. There is a very insightful chapter in Towards an African Revolution, where Fanon speaks about the assassination of Lumumba. If you have not read it, it's something I would suggest you read. But for purposes of today's discussion, in the South African context, July is also an important month because it marks the 52nd anniversary of the founding of SASO, the South African Students' Organization. In 1968, you know, its official launch rather, on the 1st of July. So it is also very, very, very important, you know. So as it relates to Black slave rebellions as manifestations of Black consciousness, between the 7th and 15th century, the principal oppressors of Black people were the pale-skinned Arabs and the Europeans, right? And in reaction to these invasions by the Arabs and the Europeans, successive generations of Black people waged gallant rebellions. These rebellions happened in Africa, as you know, the so-called Middle East, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. These rebellions took place on the slave routes, on the slave ships, on the various slave plantations across the world, and they also produced a number of warriors for the black race, right? So one of the earliest and the least spoken about rebellions is the Zanj rebellion of black slaves during the period 868 rather, and 883 CE, which took place in what is called Iraq today, right? This was a rebellion by Africans who were taken from what was known as Nubia, which is modern day Sudan and Ethiopia. And they conquered that part of the world and they established their own polities. It is one of the most successful slave rebellion that was led by black people. This is long before even the Haitian Revolution, right? And then in Mexico, around the period 1870, there was a black man by the name of Yanga Gaspar, who was known as the first liberator of the Americas, right? Yanga was a slave who spent about 4 decades establishing free settlements in Mexico. He staged a revolt near the plantation, which is called Veracruz, right? And he also established a small town that was called San Lorenzo del Negros in that part of the world. There is a statue currently in Mexico because Mexico is one of the places in Central America where the presence of black people continues to be erased. Then in 1670 in Brazil, there was a warrior by the name of Zumbi dos Palmeiros, one of the principal leaders of the black Brazilian slave. He was a descendant of the Impangala warriors of Angola and leader of the Quilombos. The Quilombos, as you know, were settlements that black people established there. And he waged an uprising there against the Portuguese. He unfortunately was killed. And then today in Brazil, the anniversary of his death is marked as National Black Consciousness Day every year on the 20th of November in Brazil. It's a day that is related to the assassination and beheading of Zumbi dos Palmeiros. It's called National Black Consciousness Day in Brazil. In Jamaica, you had a rebellion that was led by a female warrior known as Queen Nanny, from about 1720 to 1739. And you also had the Haitian Revolution, as I have said, 1791 to 1801, which had people like Francois Macandal, Juti Bokman Tosan, Louverture, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Now, there are a number of things that are often said about the Haitian Revolution, and people usually just stop by saying it was one of the most successful. It established the first independent Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. But one of the things that is also not said, or two rather, of the things that is not said about the Haitian Revolution, or that is not prominent, it's one, people like Juti Bokman, who was originally from Jamaica, by the way, and Francois Macandal, were the spiritual leaders of the Haitian Revolution. And they used African spirituality, which other people vulgarize as voodoo, which was critical in the success of the Haitian Revolution. But there's another important aspect of the Haitian Revolution that is not spoken about. It is the involvement of African warrior queens like Suzanne Louverture and Falaside Dessalines, right? And one of the African warrior scholars who is very, very instructive and knowledgeable on this subject is Professor Baina Bello, who teaches us about the role that the liberation Shiros played in the Haitian Revolution. There is a book I recommend. It is titled Shiros of the Haitian Revolution by Baina Bello. Then you also know about the Nat Turner uprising 1831 in the United Snakes of America. One of the interesting things about the Nat Turner uprising is that it changed the whole reaction of the white supremacist, this thing, rising. They became more brutal and more harsh because of that's the nature of the Nat Turner revolution. The other one that I want to speak about, which is less spoken about, in what is called today Australia, that part of the world where the British set up a criminal colony, which they call Australia. In the 1800s, there was a black, this thing, you know, a number of them rather, but one of them is the Terra Norero of Emu Bay in a place that is called Tasmania in that part, which was led by our own people and a female warrior who led an uprising there against the Europeans there in the process of warding them off when they wanted to establish the criminal colony, which we today know as Australia. This is just to make the point that when we talk of slave rebellions, they are not just something that happened on the African continent or in the Americas, or they happened across the world, even in the Pacific, right? On the African continent, so while that was happening across the world, I was giving you just a global synopsis. Even on the African continent, there were concurrent slave rebellions that the Africans were waging on the African continent. And you would know the rebellions that were waged by people like Queen Nzinga Mpande, the name of my daughter, Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia, 1896, who thrashed the Italians in the Battle of Adwa, one of the successful battles. Queen Yasantewa, the Queen Mother of the Adweso tribe in Ghana. Then in the 20th century, you continued to see the evolution of what I called Black consciousness, Pan-Africanist resistance, right? In the mid-20th century, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, under the leadership of, amongst others, the legendary General Dedan Kimathi, in the southernmost tip, in what you call the Western Cape today, right? From as early as 1659, you had a series of resistance wars that were led by indigenous warriors like the Strandlopers, the Gorinkwa, and young warriors that are people like Gogosa and Doman, you know, who are classified by racist anthropologists as Khoi. In what is called KwaZulu, around 1879, when we trounced the British in the Battle of Isandlwana, right, under Inkosi uCetshwayo, where one of my great ancestors was one of the commanders in chief, Umkhosi Omkhulu wamabutho wakaZulu, uMavumengwane kaNdlela Ntuli. In what is referred to as the Eastern Cape, there was what is sometimes referred to as the Frontier Wars or the Africa's 100-Year Wars, which were a series, as you know, of 9 anti-colonial wars between 1779 and 1879. One of the people who led this was Ukumkani Uzanzolo, Ukumkani Uyinsa. So when you talk about this resistance, you must also mention the name of Ukumkani Uyinsa. Then there was, of course, towards the early parts of the 20th century, 2 other important rebellions. One in Namibia that was led by the Herero and the Nama, 2 people, Nicholas Waterboer and Samuel Maharero, against the Germans, who committed the first genocide of the 20th century in Namibia. And of course, the Bambata uprising, Bambata Kamancinza Zondi of 1906, right? So all of those, in my view, there are many others, constitute what we can call the evolution, right, of Black consciousness resistance over the period that I've described, from as early as 800 CE to 1906, right? So that's a period of over 1,000 years, almost 2,000 years of resistance, long before the name and or the concept, you know, of Black consciousness was even in books. But you had in character the type of resistance that would qualify as Black consciousness or Pan-Africanist type resistance. What are the key observations? In my view, the Black radical theory, right, of the 19th and the 20th century, because you also noticed between the 19th and 20th century, this was the time where a lot of the literature around the whole spectrum of Black radical theory that exists today was developed mainly during the 19th and 20th century. This is when it gained traction. I'm not saying it started in the 19th and 20th century, but I'm just saying it gained more traction during that period. And it produced the discourses that we know today as Black consciousness, Pan-Africanism, Afrocentricity, African or Black nationalism, and even more recently, Black radical feminism, right, which also draws from those narratives. Now, all of these were highly influenced by the experiences of Black people, both as, you know, objects of colonial violence, but also as agents of anti-slavery resistance over the period that I've described. It is also from this historical experience that the ideas of people like Prince Hall, Paul Kofi, David Walker, James Johnson, Edward Blyden, Henry Sylvester Williams, Carter Woodson, George Padmore, Marcus Garvey, Cyril James, Martin Delaney, Henry Garnet, Alexandra Crummell, Amy Cooper, Amy Garvey, Florence Kennedy, and more contemporary terms, the ideas of people like Marimba Ani, Cheikh Anta Diop, Runoko Rashidi, Ivan van Settima, Chancellor Williams, Ferdinand Cesar, one of the people who taught Fanon, Theobald Obenga, Asa Willard, Berifile, Omar Fanon, Ben Yokanan, Amos Wilson, Chinwezi, etc. There are many, and even our own Muziwakele Mbete, Bantu Biko, Mangaliso Sobukwe. All of those people who have mentioned, right, who have been contributors to the evolution of Black radical thought and practice are products of the over 1,000 years of Black slave rebellions I've referred to, that it is those Black slave rebellions that influenced the ideas and the postulations of the people that I've mentioned over this period of time. There are a number of lessons that these rebellions also teach us. One of them is that for the longest of time, Black people everywhere in the world have existed in a context of slavery, right? So even when Black people have declared independence and freedom, right, Black people continue to exist in a context of slavery, even when they have declared freedom and or independence. In spite of the vicious and brutal nature of the violence that periodically got unleashed on Black people throughout the various epochs of slavery. And you must note, I talk about epochs of slavery and not necessarily the end of slavery, right? Black people, through various people, you know, had risked their lives and had within themselves people who rose up against their enslavers. 3, these rebellions also inform us that at various times, Black women played a very leading and important role in the slave rebellions or resistance. 4, the existential reality of Black people is not comparable or identical to that of any other racial group on earth. I know there are people who always want to white male, and note, I don't say black male, who like to white male Black people into solidarity with other groups and want to argue that their oppression is comparable I'm one of those who thinks it is not true. 5, regardless of where they are or where they were in the world, all Black people were pitted against an all-consuming and obliterating force, anti-Blackness. 6, if we accept the Black experience as interconnected, transgenerational, and transcontinental, then it is sensible to view our contemporary resistance history in South Africa, that is, as represented by, amongst others, the Sharpeville Uprising, the Soweto Uprising, the Marikana Uprising, and of course, the Fees Must Fall moment, that all of these are nothing else but slave rebellions in the context of our time. Lastly, Black people everywhere continue to exist in a context of slavery. And to help us understand this point, right, and its intricacies as it connects between our past and our present, in his book, Blood in the Eye, George Jackson makes the point that, and I quote, "The terms of our servitude are all that has been altered." The terms of our servitude are all that has been altered, which means our servitude has not ended or has not been changed. The only thing that has changed are the terms and conditions of our servitude. What have I said with this short presentation? With this short presentation, I have said, or this is what I'm suggesting, that while the name Black consciousness is a recent phenomenon, right, of the 19th to the 20th century, Black consciousness as liberation theory and praxis is something that is as old as the resistance history of Black people, which is a history of more than 2,000 years. Kamak, I want to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veli. Without wasting any time, because we are still going to be taking questions from people who are also watching this meeting. So let me just give over to Thando, who will be speaking on Black consciousness as a philosophy for resistance, liberation, and revolution. Over to you, Thando.
Greetings, sons and daughters of the soil. And firstly, I'd really like to also just express my gratitude and thanks to Black Space for really organizing, this very important dialogue. And I think it's a very necessary dialogue. But I think I would also like to just take a moment, sons and daughters of the soil, and just pay my condolences to the families of all those Black people who have lost their lives in the ongoing violence that we are seeing around the country at the moment. I think when we are talking about the relevance of Black consciousness in the current, political environment that we are going through in the country, it's very important that we pay homage to the lives of our people that have been lost. Lastly, I want to also thank you, Veli, for that rich history, of the contributions of our ancestors in the fight against, settler colonialism and racism, white supremacy. For me, I've revised a little bit of my topic, and I've said that I'll speak about Black consciousness as a philosophy for power, liberation, and revolution. And, I want us to, when we're speaking about Black consciousness, to really start from the very beginning. And Africa Veli's presentation has shown that Black consciousness does not begin, in the late 1960s with Bantu Biko and the birth of SASO. And it shows that, SASO and the BCM and Biko were merely a continuation of a long tradition of, Black radical theory, but also a praxis. I think I like the fact that Africa emphasized that BC was not merely only about theory and theorizing, but it was also about praxis. It was about being practical. So for me, Black consciousness as a conceptual framework is not merely a responsive philosophy. It is inherently proactive, and it is self-determining and a self-actualizing philosophy. So basically, we did not only have Black consciousness when Biko and Sasso and his colleagues were responding, to the racism and the oppression of the racists settlers here in Azania. But Black consciousness predates Biko and his generation. So what I want to do here in Mnama Africa, I'm going to speak about Black consciousness before colonialism. And then I will speak about Black consciousness after colonialism very briefly. And then I want to also just focus a little bit on Biko as a rebel philosopher, and the notion of Biko as a philosopher. And then the last issue that I will look at is the problem of abstract philosophy. Eurocentric philosophy is rooted in abstractions and so forth. So I will just speak briefly on that. So on BC, before colonialism, Africa, it is an accepted fact that Africa is the cradle of humanity. This has been said by academics and various other scholars on many different platforms over and over. It is also in the education curricula that humanity began in Africa, let alone that they advance the Darwinist theories, even when they acknowledge that humanity began in Africa. It is still located within the paradigm of Eurocentric thought, Darwinism and so forth, you see. So, but one less accepted fact is the fact that Africa is not only the cradle of humanity, but Africa is also the cradle of civilization, and Africa is also the cradle of all the scientific disciplines of the world. And so if we acknowledge that fact, and we look at the civilizations that thrived throughout the African continent, civilizations like the Kushite empires, the ancient Nubia, and even Kemet, all of these civilizations were rooted in a particular principle of acknowledging Blackness as a divine principle. I mean, just a simple fact of the matter. The words Kush, after which our people called themselves, the word Kush means black. The land, the word Kemet, which is the original African word for the country called Egypt, it means the black land or the land of the blacks. But if you look even here in Azania, Otato, Sobukwe, Nobiko, they referred to this particular part of the country as Azania for a specific reason that, they were acknowledging an ancient civilization that thrived here. And when you define the word Azania, it means the land of the blacks. So the concept of blackness is not only something that exists, when we encounter resistance to European racism and oppression and so forth. It is something that is inherent within us as Africans. And there was no European person or European civilization, when these black civilizations thrived thousands of years ago. So I want to emphasize the fact that, our people referred to their civilizations as black civilizations, and a number of scholars, some of which Africa has already mentioned, have already proved and attested to this. For example, Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, in his books, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, and in his other book, Pre-Colonial Black Africa, and in his last book, Civilization or Barbarism, he debunked the Eurocentric and the racist discipline of Egyptology, and proved scientifically that, contrary to what they were teaching in these universities and so forth, the Egyptian civilization was built by Black people. You know that Europeans have always tended to claim that Egypt is not a part of the African continent. They would make claims that it is somehow related to the Arabs. And when they speak about that civilization of ancient Kemet, they would always construct certain theories that, you know, seek to deny the fact that this was a Black civilization built by Black people. For example, they tend to claim that Egypt was built by, you know, some aliens from out of space and all these other crazy theories. So it was Cheikh Anta Diop who proved it scientifically, you know, that in fact, the Egyptian civilization was a Black civilization. And it was also Diop himself who also informed us that the original word or the original name for the country called Egypt was Kemet, which to erect these structures, you know, and these monuments were not just simple monuments for amusement and for tourism, as it happens today, but these were cornerstone institutions for forthcoming generations to keep the message going, the message of Blackness going, you know, and I think that's why, you know, they housed these ideas of Black divinity and the divinity of Blackness, the divinity of our melanin, the divinity of the cosmos, the dark cosmos, and so forth. All of these ideas were put in these institutions so that they could be perpetuated to forthcoming generations, so that we could understand that, you know, Black is a divine principle. So I'm going to move forward, Africa, and you know, just so that I don't waste much time. These institutions of civilizations, you know, were effectively what I call symbols of Black power. So when we lift up, you know, our Black Power feast today and say Black Power, Amandla Mnyama, and so forth, for me, this is not only merely a political statement, but an assertion of really who we are, where we come from, our past, our history, and so forth, you know, because these civilizations, these monuments are still, you know, startling the world today as to how Black people managed to institutionalize and build these institutions. And I want to connect this idea of building institutions in prehistoric Africa to the Black consciousness movement that emerges in the late 1960s. Because when the Black consciousness movement emerges through Sasso and Biko, they were not only concerned with philosophy and philosophizing for the sake of philosophizing, you know. Their main issue that they were concerned with, you know, was dealing with a particular power structure. And one of the things that the Black consciousness movement did and thrived in, which is what I want to connect to what our ancestors in Kemet, in Kush, in Songhai, in ancient Azania did, is that they built institutions. So Biko was not only theorizing and speaking and platforms and sharing ideas and writing and so forth. They were busy doing that work of theory, but at the same time, they were building institutions on the ground in the communities. And I won't waste time mentioning some of these important institutions that they built, but they built clinics, they built a number of schools, They built a number of factories and so forth, which institutions were meant, you know, to assist the way of life of African people, to perpetuate the way of life of African people, to help and assist Black people, that we do not become a people who are dependent on other races and other people in order to exist and survive, sons of the soil. Now, like I've said, these institutions were symbols of Black power, the power of thought, the power to self-define, the power to define our reality, the power to self-determine, but also the power to create and construct, you see. Now, I want to look very briefly at BC after colonialism, because Africa Veli has really elaborated much on this. But I just want to add and say that the Garveyite movement of Makosi Garvey, the Rastafari movement of Leonard Howell, Nation of Islam of Elijah Muhammad, the MOVE organization of John Africa, the Black Power movement of Kwame Ture, the Black Panther Party for self-defense of Huey P. Newton, the Land and Freedom movement of Dedan Kimati, all of these emerged as a response to the white system. So this is now Black consciousness. You know, Africa Veli has elaborated on the slave rebellions and so forth as manifestations of Black consciousness. So I want to add and say that these movements were also, you know, a part and parcel of that manifestation and the expression of Black consciousness, with Black people self-defining, Black people determining their own destiny and determining their own reality, you know. And they were inspired by, you know, obviously our story, our past, and the experience of oppression, you know, and, you know, in what they were doing. But I also want to believe that, as I said earlier, it was the inherent Blackness, that divine Blackness, that divine Black voice that speaks, you know, that I spoke about, you know, that Black voice of our ancestors that was also moving, you know, these leaders who created these movements to resist against the system of racism, white supremacy. These were not only political and social movements, they were revolutionary movements responding and resisting against a particular philosophical worldview, which we call racism and white supremacy. So racism and white supremacy are philosophical worldviews. It is upon these philosophical worldviews that the white domination, white oppression, white culture, and the society that we call, you know, white civilization today exists. It is rooted on this philosophy, you know, which is called racism, white supremacy. Lastly, Africa, just so that, because other ideas will emerge when we are talking. But the one last point I want to speak is about Biko himself, you know, as a rebel philosopher. You know, Biko stressed how our power derives from our consciousness, our minds. You know, that quote that is, I think the quote, it's said to be from Tiro, but it's usually, you know, alluded to Biko, which says the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. You know, I'm not sure Mafribu Veli will correct me if that's the one now. But you know, what I'm talking about here is the issue that Biko stressed how power, our power, Black power, derives from our state of consciousness and our mind state. So Biko was not very much obsessed with, like I said earlier, philosophizing for the sake of philosophy and theory, you know, about theory and theorizing about, you know, sweet nothings and so forth. He was concerned about changing the psychological, the political, the spiritual well-being of Black people. These were the issues that Biko was really concerned about. So it was not just a philosopher for the sake of, you know, a philosopher in the European kind of sense. For example, your racist white philosophers, Western philosophers like Abo Plato, Abo Socrates, and, you know, all of these other racists who were simply, you know, obsessed with abstract philosophy and so forth, you know, and not with the material issues and issues that concern, you know, the lives of people on the ground. You see? So from Biko's point of view, philosophy is not a disembodied system of ideas or a mechanical reflection of the world. It is a way of being, you know, in the world. It's a way of life. It's a way of acting in the world, you know, and that's why people like Professor Mabogo More says that Biko was essentially an Afrikaner existential philosopher, you know, and he further says that for Biko, to be a philosopher is not just to hold, you know, certain views. It is also a way of being and a way of perceiving the world, what Biko calls a way of life. This is what Professor Moore says in speaking about Biko. The last point, last point, Africa, for me, is this problem of abstract philosophy, you know, and it leads me to the main topic under which we are speaking here, and that is the issue and the question of the relevance of Black consciousness after 1994, you know. And for me, I want to say that Veli, you know, spoke about this notion of a post-1994, you know, what is a post-1994? Does it really exist? Are we post anything? And so forth. So for me, 1994 was a moment of infection with, you know, what Amilcar Cabral called the cancer of betrayal, you know, a betrayal of a nation, you know, betrayal of a people who have been dispossessed by white supremacy and so forth. And, you know, we usually always speak about this issue of Black consciousness is relevant after 1994. And obviously it is relevant because for me, Black consciousness is timeless. You know, it is relevant whether or not we are experiencing and dealing with white racism and oppression, or whether we are just being and living our lives and trying to restore who we are and our humanness. Black consciousness is just there, it's timeless. But now, when you come to this issue and the question of, you know, Black consciousness after 1994 as a movement, BCM as a movement, there are many questions and many holes that I want to poke, and I'm hoping that Veli, we can engage on these issues, because the fact of the matter is that after 1994, a number of BCM stalwarts and cadres of Biko, men and women who marched on you know, on the front line with Biko, men who sat and discussed and theorized with Biko, shared ideas and so forth with Biko, people who you know were leaders in the Black consciousness movement. A number of them went into government positions after 1994. They became leaders in various sectors in government, in the education system, in, you know, in the religious spaces and so forth. You know, a number of them were vice chancellors. Some of them were even advisors to, you know, former President Thabo Mbeki and so forth. So, you know, they've been leaders in the SABC, which means we have had BCM people in the entertainment space and so forth, and the media. But the question is, why is it that all of these philosophical ideas have never translated into, you know, any legislation, into anything practical for Black people? Why is it that we have got people who lived with Biko, marched with Biko, theorized with Biko, people who have had the opportunity, had the means, the resources and so forth, but none of those people have really done anything significant. And I'm talking even in terms of building institutions. What institutions have we built? You know, what institutions have these leaders who lived and breathed with Biko, had Biko's voice and so forth? They've built no institutions for Black people after 1994. And so for me, this is the tragedy which I refer to as this cancer of betrayal. And it is a betrayal not only to Black people, but also to Biko himself. And I think I would like to stop there, Africa.
Okay, thank you so much, Thando. I think one of the key concepts, that you have mentioned in both of your speeches was 1994. And just generally, Tina, in Black space, we refer to 1994 as a moment, as a political moment which meant not an end to colonialism or to apartheid, but it meant the extension of colonialism and apartheid, because the people themselves, Africans whose land was invaded and who were dispossessed of their land and who were thus conquered, it did not mean anything symbolic to them. That moment of 1994, it is what Saidiya Hartman calls a non-event of emancipation. So, but post-1994, after 1994, we have seen movements like Black Wash, September National Imbizo, and there's always been this rift that exists between Pan-Africanist and BC movements or organizations, but Black Wash made it, it got rid of that rift, and in getting rid of that rift, it made Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism complementary, because these are two sides of the same coin. We are fighting the same battle. We are in the same struggle. You see that? So, but as we go on, it becomes difficult also, So the question that I want to pose to the both of you is that why is it difficult for BC or Pan-Africanist organizations or movements to sustain themselves? Because you can see with the Black Wash how it came, into the national discourse, saying that 1994 changed focal. You see that, and we also see the same Black Wash, losing momentum, becoming demobilized, breaking into SNI and others, small groupings. So the question that I want to pose to the both of you is that why is it difficult for BC movements and organizations to sustain themselves? I think
okay, it's a difficult question, Diawon. Let me start by saying I'm still recovering from that mind-shifting presentation, Yeah, it was mind-shifting, very, very well. And so I enjoyed listening to Uqwanini speak as usual, right? So I want to say there are certain things you must accept. I'm not going to say other things in this Tringayo, when I respond to some of those issues here. And I would like for us to speak on a different platform about some of the issues. So if you pick up some deficiencies in my responses, it could be because I've decided to edit some of the things given the nature of the issues we are dealing with, but also the time we are in. So I will just start by saying anything that associates itself or calls itself Black consciousness or Pan-Africanism poses a threat, right? A serious threat to the system, the globalized system of white supremacy, racism. Now, it is such a threat that even if organizations that call themselves BC or Pan-Africanist do not take themselves seriously, the system takes them very seriously, to the extent that the system will do whatever is possible to make sure that those organizations or those movements do not see the light of day and they die a natural death. So what I'm suggesting is that some of the problems that you see in these movements that you have mentioned are not necessarily issues that relate to the behavior weaknesses of individuals. They also relate to what the system does to make sure that those organizations do not see the light of day, because there is a huge historical precedence, right, that all our movements that sought to organize our people, both in thought and in practice against the system, those movements receive a lot of attention and brutality from the system, right? So, but then you also find another problem, and it is what Utwanini spoke about. Part of the big problem with especially the organizations that call themselves BC is the obsession with philosophical navel gazing, right? Which is behaving like typical European philosophers, where they want to create personality cults against who is a thinker and who is a theoretician and who is not, as opposed to working on the most important thing, which is a liberatory program. You know, so there is also problems of personality cults and egos, because there are people who want to be known or seen as the Bikos of today, the Sobukwes of today, the Lembedas of today. And those are the other things that make people fight. And when those people get challenged or their ideas get challenged legitimately, so it creates problems in these spaces, right? Because this is also what these organizations manifest. And then I also think there's also a problem of where people are involved in textbookish, right, activism, which is not necessarily revolution, because in revolution, it does not have to do with whether or not one is part of an organization or one is a leader. You know, revolution has to do with how we understand our material reality at a particular time and what role we play. You know, so there are people who think if they are not in particular organizations or in particular positions, there is no revolution, right? So, and this is why we sometimes make the mistake of thinking the weaknesses of movements like the PAC and ARZAPO are necessarily a general weakness of Black people. You know, it is not true. These movements are weak, yes, and some of them are on their knees, but it is not true that there are no Black people who are not organizing and there are no Black people who are not fighting against the system. So my point is also, we must also not conflate these movements and try to create the impression that these movements are the revolution. They are not. I think there's something that you shared, which was written by Mbele, you know, when he was just analogizing how what we see currently, right? And he was making the point where that there is no movement at the moment that can claim that it is responsible for part of what we are seeing happening today, right? And that is the point that I'm also trying to caution us against, that when we measure the success or failure of Black consciousness as a liberation theory and praxis, we must not confine it to the successes or failure of the movements that call themselves BC or Pan-Africanism, because the philosophies and praxis of BC and Pan-Africanism are bigger than those movements. And I dare say, Black consciousness will continue to live beyond the life or death of any movement that calls itself Black consciousness or anything, you know. So, but my initial point is, I just think the movements that call themselves Black consciousness, the ones, especially the ones that came after 1994, have not taken the time to study the ways of our enemies and how our enemies operate. You know, they think, like Mao says, that revolution is a dinner party or writing an essay. I want to leave it at that.
Okay, Thando, what's your take on why? Okay.
Hayi ubhele lihle uwadle onke, you know, as usual. Yamazi ubhele uvele anabe, you know. So, but you know, I think there's just there's 4 points which I've written down here as a response to the question. For me, the first one is what Africa Ubele has already mentioned, the issue of personality cults, but I also want to say the issue of personality differences, you know, and a sense of competition, you know, amongst Africa. You tend to find that people in these movements, like Africa has said, they want to be the deputy Bikos, they want to be the Bikos of today, you know, and so forth, and all of these other things that you see people trying to do, you see. So there is a sense at which there is no sincerity. People are not really genuinely sincere with what they are doing. I think that's the first point. And I want to relate that point to because, you know, conceptions of inferiority complex and self-hatred. That I think that the reason why we behave in this manner, we compete amongst one another, we compete to be called, you know, the Biko of the day and so forth, is it's rooted in, you know, our internalized inferiority complexes and our self-hatred. It's just another way in which it manifests itself for me. The second one, I think there is a certain level and a certain degree to which even, you know, those die-hard Black consciousness adherents or Pan-Africanists, they aspire to integrate into the system. So there is a certain level at which people simply want to integrate into the system. So people don't want to dismantle and destroy the system completely. They merely want to reform it. And I think it contributes to the question. The third issue for me, which I can't leave out, because as Africa has said, you know, people have died, you know, for these ideas. Even if at the moments when we don't take ourselves seriously, when we take our activities and the little things, actions that we do, you know, as insignificant, but the system takes them very seriously. So there is the question for me of infiltration, and it may manifest itself in a number of ways, you see, in order to subvert this idea, to subvert this movement and all of these, you know, activities that people would be trying to do, trying to organize and so forth, you know. So I think that's the other point. The last point for me is the question of power or powerlessness. You know, the fact that we are a powerless people, my brother. And the issue of power and powerlessness, it affects us. You know, no matter how you can look at it, it affects our ability to create. It affects our ability to sustain that which we have created, you know, and so forth. So it's just those questions for me, the issue of integration, aspiring to integrate personality cults, differences, self-hatred, and so forth, infiltration and power. So I think those are the issues. And for as long as we don't address and deal with those questions and those issues, my brother, we will continue to, you know, to be challenged by these, because it's not only these movements that emerge after 1994 that are going through this. It's also the, you know, traditional movements, your AZAPO, your Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. They are going through this very same issue, you know, my brother. So that's where I leave it.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So, and one of the key contributions of Black consciousness to, you know, South African politics was the definition of Black, you know, and this definition of Black is often, you know, distorted, you know, to, I think, you know, people use it for their own ends, you know, because they harbor, you know, these desires to integrate, as Thando has said, you know. So, and looking now with what's happening in the country, you know, the looting and the protests that are happening in KZN. And I've seen videos circulating on social media, a video of Indians who are actually burning the squatter camps of people who they assumed they looted, or people who they suspect they looted from those malls, you know. So it becomes interesting how other people, you know, when they look at these situations, when they look at these things, you know, they often say on the basis of the act, you know, or an act of anti-blackness towards Black people, you know, from Indians, then altogether Black consciousness definition of Black is irrelevant. Understand? And I think they often misunderstand Biko did not say all Indians or all colors can be Black. He says that once they've committed themselves to fight against all forms of anti-Blackness, then they can be considered as Black. So I just want to ask Gucci, what's your take on that? You know, I think Veli can go first, and then Thando can go after that. You know, when you look at all these, you know, situations, all these videos, all these, you know, I think it becomes interesting. It becomes an interesting moment for Black consciousness thought, you know, to constantly sharpen ourselves. And I think, as Veli often says, if we don't sharpen ourselves, you know, with theory, with, you know, constantly with knowledge, I think we get stuck with gossip and other things that are unnecessary.
True.
You see that? So
True.
I just want to ask Veli first, and then Thando can go after that. You know, what's your take on that? You know, I think it becomes so interesting, and I think it also affects, because theoretically all these things can be there, but on the ground, you know, it becomes a different story, you know. So I'm just trying to get you know, how do you see it? Okay, we can go with Thando.
Yeah, I knew that question was going to come up, you know, because I've been grappling with it, and I was dealing with it with. So I'm one of the people who has been calling for an open discussion on how Black consciousness is conceived in the South African context and the Indian question, right? And I also raised the issue of people like Gandhi, right? How Gandhi is revered. But you see, I've also said to people, part of the problem has to do with the Black experience is not a South African phenomenon. You know, the Black experience is a global phenomenon. And so some of us, when we speak of Black people or Blackness, we confine ourselves to South Africa. You know, I often, for instance, when you raise the Indian question, I look at what Black people, what Indians have done to Black people in India and continue to do, you know. So the issue that Gwanini raised about anti-Blackness in India, that is not spoken about even amongst people who call themselves Black radicals, theorists or scholars. And I don't know where the radical is if people do not take a global view of our relationship with other races, you know, so as to come to a bigger and broader picture of what our relationship should be and whether or not we should be in solidarity, you know, with certain groups. So I've made that point in that discussion long before what is happening today. But I've also said that, you see, Indians have always been anti-Black as a group. It did not start now. So I was not surprised by what I saw there. You know, my own lived experience with them, but also the lived experience of our people in India. You know, the issue, I don't know if you know about a group called the Siddhis in India. You know, they are trapped between India and Pakistan, and the treatment that they continue to have. So I consider those types of things as well, because concepts that we used, right, to define ourselves and define our reality should also be grounded in an authentic understanding of history and not just part of history, because it is history that informs how we act and how we behave, right? So that's the other point. The other point is, I just think we must have an open discussion about the issue of whether Indians are Black, you know, and if they are Black, how are they Black? Because I think we tend to be dismissive, right, when Africans raise that issue. And we don't want to understand from which perspective do they come. And we also forget, by the way, if you go amongst the elders of the Black consciousness movement, they will tell you it took them over a year to come to that definition of what Black is. It was not a one-day event, over a year. And the various components of what constitute Black were discussed, you know. So my point is, we must not also apply, and I don't want to say Biko's definition because it's not his, the definition of SASO of Black. We must not apply it dogmatically, but we must understand the circumstances that informed that definition at the time. And we must ask, do those circumstances obtain today, and are they still valid? Because you see, you can't assess the validity of that definition if you do not study the circumstances that gave birth to it, because that's how you will understand what they call in law the intent of the legislature. You know, so you can't wish away the experience of Black people in KZN with the Indians purely on the basis that Biko said. You must engage with that experience for what it is and see whether that experience leads us to a different definition of Black, you know. So that's what I think we need to do. Let's have an open and more honest discussion about our relationship with Indians.
Well, Mnama Africa, I think Africa Veli has put it very beautifully, especially up at the end where he speaks about the circumstances, you know, which led SASO to, you know, derive that specific definition. And I think those circumstances will give us the proper context. And, you know, the historical context of KwaZulu-Natal as well is very important, Africa, you see, because you know that the history of, you know, the enslavement of these Indians and how they were brought into that area and so forth. But what I also want us to not forget is the racism that prevails amongst Indians themselves. Like I said, not only in India, where you find the light-skinned Indian, you know, who I call the mulatto Indian, you know, who oppresses the Black Indian, you see, who they call, you know, the cities or the untouchables or whatever other kind of derogatory names that they may give to them. But, you know, so we have to speak about that dynamic of the fact that Indians amongst themselves, you've seen, they have racist attitudes towards those who are Black-skinned, you know, Indians. So I think that point is very important. And I think part of the reason to this, like I said earlier, India is originally a Black civilization. So these mulatto, light-skinned Indians who have internalized these racist attitudes, they are descendants of the Asiatic and the Arab settlers who raped our ancestors in India, you know, and, you know, they are the descendants of that offspring, basically, these mulatto, these mixed breed Indians, these light-skinned Indians who see themselves as, you know, white people, or if not white people, better than, you know, black people, basically. They are not the kafirs, you see, and they also, they see themselves as not the coolies as well. You see, they are better Indians as well, you see. So I think that's the other point that we must not miss. So when Biko and Isaso come up with the definition yabo, it's within that particular context, it's informed by their environment and so forth. But like Africa Veli has said, we must interrogate and engage with the ideas Zabo Biko. Similarly to, you know, this idea of Uba Osobuko and the PAC, that anyone who pays allegiance to the African continent can be regarded as an African and so forth. These are notions and ideas which we as this generation must not simply regurgitate and, you know, parrot and so forth. We must engage with these ideas, you know, and try to test these ideas and see if they really are practical in our current, you know, environment today. But the last thing I want to say is that our Black consciousness, like we've said, Black consciousness does not begin or end with Biko. And I think that our Black consciousness, we need to move towards a Garveyite type of Black consciousness, a Black consciousness that is centered around the idea of race consciousness, race first, as Marcus Garvey put it. And I think that this is what will take us forward from, you know, where Biko and them left off, because, you know, I do think that Black people do need a space for ourselves only as Black people, you know, outside of any other race or any other people. And I think the sooner we organize that space, the better for us.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Since we are talking about the definition of Black, according to Black consciousness, you know, and there's also, you know, the distinction there is between that definition of Black and with another, you know, the non-white, you know, to say that those who seek comfort, those who want to integrate, those who don't harbor any desire to attenuate the system that oppresses us as Black people, those ones are non-whites, you know, and just maybe just adjacent to that, let us talk about the differences that exist between Black people, among Black people, you know, the differences of gender, class, culture, you know, all these things, you know. So what do you think about the rise of feminist thought within Black consciousness, you know, movements now, you know, because you can see, Huti, you know, although like movements before, you know, even Black space itself, you know, movements like Black Wash, you know, SNI, and all these movements that, you know, there's been a rise of Black consciousness, of feminist thought, even during Fees Must Fall, Rose Must Fall, all these other movements, these recent movements, you know. So why do you think, Huti, there is this constant rise, you know, in feminist thought within these Black consciousness or Pan-Africanist movements?
Okay, well, I'm not sure if there is a rise, right? I'm not sure if there's a rise because what you see happening is that this is a phenomenon that is mainly prevalent amongst people who are at university, right? It's something that is now a university is generally a white liberal space, right? Where people encounter all sorts of ideas, and so the ideas that dominate in the university space are not necessarily the ideas that are generated by Black people, because the university is part of the power structure of whiteness. So the ideas that we encounter in the university space, both in and outside the lecture halls, are not necessarily our own ideas. So I also don't want us to magnify what happens in university spaces and movements on universities as a general phenomenon, right? But I'm also not downplaying its significance because it is something that we are seeing. That's the first point. The second point is, I always start by saying, when we say feminism, I don't want to be pedantic, but I think it assists us for theoretical clarity. When we say feminism, we often speak as if there is a universal understanding of what brand of feminism we are talking about, right? My own limited knowledge, I know there exist over 50 brands of feminism globally. And when people often say they are feminists and you want to pin them down to understand what brand or current of feminists are they, the discussion gets a bit more tricky for them, you know, because when you drill down to it as to how people define themselves as feminist, it is not so much in terms of clear theoretical constructs, right? But it is more insofar as how people understand what the relationship between them and men should be, you know. So you don't generally have a theoretical postulation in an atmosphere where people exchange ideas like we are doing to understand that when people say feminism, what do they mean, you know? So there's always a necessary hit, right? So I don't think a space has existed, or we have created a space where, as Black brothers, we sit down with our Black sisters who call themselves feminists to try and understand what exactly do they mean and how does what they are advancing relate to the broader struggle of Black people or African people. So there is a struggle at the moment to have that conversation going. And I've always said, as you know, I don't think it is useful for us to have these constant exchanges on social media with Black sisters who call themselves feminists. I think we must go the route that Uqwanini is suggesting. Let's close ourselves as in a room as Black people or Africans or exclusively and drill down to understand what exactly do they mean with this. Why do I say this? If you look at the genesis, right, of feminism, especially in the US, the feminist movement in the US was used to counter the emergence of the Black Power movement in the US. There are declassified CIA documents that show how the feminist movement, the Black feminist movement, was used to undermine the Black Power struggle in the US. And they used very eloquent and very grounded Black women to advance that agenda. In fact, some of the women were not even aware that some of the work they were doing was part of a CIA project, right? And so, but there is no space, in my view, in the current political space for a discussion that will help us to even drill down and deal with these types of issues that I'm raising. And that's why I'm suggesting we need a space where we can deal with these things, because the evolution of Black feminist activism in South Africa is a fairly recent and new phenomenon, you know, that we must interrogate. So we have not resolved its place, right, in what we define as the national liberation struggle in the South African context. We have not resolved the place or the role of Black feminism. And we need a proper space to resolve that, because in the liberation movement, right, there's been the question of Black women's liberation. And so the discussion that we should be having is that is what we see and what is emerging today as Black radical feminism, is it a continuation, an extension of what we have understood or theorized as Black women's liberation in the context of the national liberation movement, you know? So we really need space to try and thresh out those types of things. I don't want to take a lot of time on that issue. I just want to raise those couple of issues. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Thando, I think I remember that you once wrote an article on the roles of Black women, Black, leaders, who were women during the formations of SASO, the formation of the Black consciousness movement as a whole, and, even the formations of others, other organs of Black consciousness, of the Black consciousness movement. So, Thando, I just want to ask, what inspired you, to actually like go back and try to understand and try to research, research on the roles of those Black women, who were in were within the Black consciousness movement. What inspired you to do that?
My brother, we live in an environment where really our approaches to history, our approaches to dialogue and to narrative, they are dominated by the very same Eurocentric, paradigm. And so very often, even when we tend to tell our stories, as Black people, we tend to emulate the very same Eurocentric approach, where we praise these singular individuals who are mainly men, male dominating figures. So these people who are usually, I called them in that article, the supermen, and yet, we tend, because of this approach to history and to narrative, we then tend to, erase the memory and, the narratives about women contributions. So I think it's important that I emphasize that it's because of our approach to narrative, to history, and so forth. It's not because women are not there. It's not because women don't exist or do not participate and are not part of the struggle, but it is because of what we have internalized. When we tell history, we tell the history of the men, and when we speak about the woman, we say so-and-so was the wife of the man, my brother. So it is that Eurocentric approach, which is, it is misogynistic. Europeans are inherently misogynistic. They do not see women as people who have contributed anything, to human civilization and so forth. So they always tend to erase, women from any narrative. Check, for example, I usually speak about this one. In Christianity, when they speak about the Trinity, they say it's the Father, the Holy Spirit, and the Son, and they've completely obliterated the woman. But when you go into ancient Africa, where this concept of the Trinity was stolen, it is the Father, it is the Mother, and the Child, which forms the perfect Trinity, which forms the eternity of humanity. It is in that way that human beings become, eternal, and that is why Veli is showing us that symbol, the symbol of the Ankh, which is showing exactly the perfect Trinity that our ancient African ancestors defined in ancient Kemet. So that's the first point that I want to make, my brother. So for me, this notion and this question of the rise of feminism, it is nothing but a divisive construct, and it works in servitude of the very same system that we are seeking to destroy, because we are oppressed as a collective, as a people. We are oppressed as Black men, Black women, and Black children. And our response to this oppression and this colonialism has always been as a collective unit, So it is these foreign ideas, which come from these liberal, Euroversities, as Veli has said, that now try and want to divide Black people, bring a wedge amongst the Black family, so that we fight our struggles now as Black men, isolated in our corner and Black women fighting their own struggles, and you have this notion now of children's rights. So our children now have their own struggles fighting for children's rights and so forth. This is part and parcel of the agenda, my brother, you see. Still part and parcel of the same agenda. Now, just for the sake of others who may be watching and listening and so forth, in the Black consciousness movement, a number of women were there. Same within the Pan-Africanist Congress. And for the sake of this discussion, I want to mention their names. For example, some of them are still alive. They are with us. These are women who were part of the formation of the BCM and part of the activities of the BCM. Veli may know more of these great mothers of ours, you know, and there are still some who are there today, you know, and still contributing great work in their communities and so forth. And for me, when we speak about Biko, the first woman I will mention is Biko, because she's still there. And I know that there may be issues. Some may say, what political activity has she contributed and so forth. But like I've said, our approach to the struggle has always been as a unit and as a collective. And I don't believe that, you know, Biko would sleep in the same, you know, bed with Umama Biko and not have discussions, sit on the table and eat, you know, supper and lunch and so forth, and not have political engagements and discussions. So I don't believe that women like Umama Biko were, you know, unthinking women, you know. So Mama Biko is one of those women. She's still there. And I believe that in the community of Ginsberg, the people there, they see her contributions in terms of her community development work, you know, the number of, you know, programs, social programs and so forth that she is a part of in that part of the world. But you've got women such as Omamo Christine Kunta, you've got Omamo Mojanko Gumbi. I mean, I'm mentioning the names of people whom I know were part and parcel of the Black consciousness movement. You've got Uma Musbongile Mkabela. Like I've said, Uma Veli may know a list of many countless other women, you know, who are there. And but the last point in speaking about these women, the Black consciousness movement of Azania is the first political organization in this country to have a Black woman as a president, you know, of its movement. And that was Mamuweni Khware, who became the president of the Black People's Convention. And this is a narrative, a story which needs to be told over and over and over, so that we understand that Black consciousness was not only dominated by male. We have had women figures, women leaders who contributed theoretically and philosophically to the ideas that we celebrate today. And it's important, like Veli said earlier, that we do not say some of the definitions which we find in a right water like belonged to Biko, but these were ideas that belonged to Saso, a collective leadership, a collective of young people who were thinking, theorizing, and so forth. Perhaps these ideas may have come from the pen of Biko, but the ideas came from the rest of them, which included a number of these Black women.
Okay, thank you so much for that. When Oput Veli was talking about the gender differences and the need for us to have conversation and dialogue as Black women and Black men, he used the line, you know, closing ourselves in the room. And there's also another difference, you know, that exists among us as Black people, which is class, you know. Do you think that the issue of class, you know, class differences, you know, class positions among Black people should also be treated as the differences that exist between us in terms of gender and sexuality? Do you think that they should be afforded the same urgency, or they should be looked at, you know, under the same light as gender differences, you know, closing ourselves in the room? Should we close ourselves in the room with the Black bourgeoisie who who are, you know, who are at the position that is higher, you know, than people who are living below the poverty line, abangananto, who are living in squatter camps, who are living in townships, you know, who are experiencing violence face to face, you know, who are not at the university, you know, imagining it, but who are experiencing it, you know, day to day. Should we treat the differences that exist among us as Black people, you know, in terms of class, with the same light as the differences that exist among us as you know, Black men, Black women, and others?
All right. So before I come in, there's something important that Ukwanini said about the ideas of, you know, how Black consciousness in the South African context. There's something I always say when we do political education classes, and Ukwanini reminded me. In the one of the initial essays delivered 1971, the definition of Black consciousness. Now, one of the points that's made in that essay is that that paper was delivered at a leadership school of SASO by Biko. So one of the points they make in that paper is that they see Black consciousness, right, as something that manifests itself globally, but the word that they use is the third world. You know, in that document, they use the word third world. Now, the point that they are making there is a recognition that they did not invent the concept, the theory, the discourse of Black consciousness. All that they did was to try and situationalize it to what they refer to as the Azanian context. Now, why is that important? That is important because the manner in which there is I don't even want to call it a school of thought, I want to call it a tendency. There is a political tendency that reduces Black consciousness to Biko, right? And it goes as far as to talk about things like Bikoism and people being Bikoist. Now, the problem with that is that when you study Biko himself as a historical subject, Biko was not egocentric or individualistic. You know, so how do you then use Biko's figure and Biko's ideas to negate the very nature of Biko? That's the second thing. The third thing is a number of things, like Ukwanini has said, that are attributed to Biko, right, were things that were originated by other people, but because at a particular point in time, circumstances dictated that somebody articulate those ideas, and they agreed that Biko must be the one who must articulate those ideas. And in the way that the system would usually react, you find yourself speaking in a meeting, and then the system uses your speech or your document and it is attributed to you. Now, in the way that history is written, it will then be recorded that Oputin Dumi said. But for your own protection, your comrades won't say that, no, that was actually said by But Andile, because there is a political agreement that you are not going to snitch on each other. So if you study, for instance, the trial, right, where Biko speaks at the trial that came after the Viva Frelimo rallies, Biko there takes responsibility, political responsibility, for things that were written by, amongst others, Obabustrini Moodley as part of the Frank Talk Journal. Some of the things were not written by him, but it was part of a political understanding that this thing is not about individual superstars. This is a collective project. So that Bikoism that we see today and that people being called Bikoist is problematic because it distorts the actual nature, right, of how Biko and how the Black consciousness movement operated in the South African context. I just thought I should make that point. Now, as it relates to your question, you see, the other important thing for us to understand is that in how a system of oppression works, Babundumi, a system of oppression can also create artificial differences, or it can also create differences that are meant to divide us and distract us, right? So it is also important that we must study these levels of contradictions, and we must not also be too quick to conclude that there are differences. You understand? Because, for instance, this thing, for instance, of saying certain Black people occupy this position in the system, but we must also understand that the system is designed such that it allocates us as Black people different levels of slavery, but they remain levels of slavery. So you find there are slaves that have got chains that are more shinier than the chains of the other slaves. And you find these slaves fighting with each other, and they want to magnify that contradiction as a major contradiction. We must always understand why it is some Black people occupy certain positions in the system, also from the perspective of the system, because we will alienate Black people, you know, who could potentially make a useful contribution to the revolution, you know. So I just say we should also be careful in just, you know, characterizing things as differences and contradictions without drilling down to them as to whether these are really differences. And one example, I don't think there's any difference between Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism. I struggle till this day, you know, to understand that there is something called Black consciousness on one side and there is something called Pan-Africanism on one side. Particularly if you look at the nature and the source of our oppression. You said it in your introductory remarks, right? The nature and or the source of our oppression is essentially one, and it is directed to us as a block. Now, that we experience the oppression at different levels, you know, should not necessarily suggest that we are not oppressed as a group or as a block. Obviously, you know, a Black man and a Black woman, by their own natural nature, right, their lived reality can't be 100% identical, because these are not 200% identical beings. But insofar as they form part and parcel of an oppressed group, you can't separate them and say the Black woman must fight for a different kind of freedom and the Black man must fight for, because the system that allocates them their position as oppressed beings is one system. It's not a different system. It simply exploits their peculiarities, you know, either as a man or as a woman. And it is a strategy to make sure that there is animosity or acrimony between them, and their focus should not be on the actual oppressor. Now, so when we go and close ourselves in a room, we will deal with all of those things. But it is also important to understand we close ourselves in a room with Black people who have the same agenda as us. You see, we are not just going to have a Vulas Buka and invite everybody into that room, because you must remember, we are not involved in a stokvel. You know, this is a revolutionary struggle. So it is also important that we protect the revolution. So not everybody is necessarily going to come into that room just because they are Black or because they are a woman or because they occupy a particular class position. It also depends what is their political agenda or interest, you know, because we want Black people who would advance the revolution, not just Black people who occupy a specific position. Thanks.
You know, hey, Mira, my brother, you know this question, Manish. This question of class, son of the soil, Mafrugo Veli has put it in the best way that I know ever, you see. But what I want to say, Mna, is, you know, under settler colonialism, the idea of class, I think it's an elusive idea, because all classes under settler colonialism are a construct of the racist white supremacist system. It is white people who create all the so-called classes that you see, you know, and it doesn't matter which class you belong to. We are all oppressed as a collective group at varying degrees. And I think Veli naye uyibekile and has put it very clearly, you see. Ukuthi, even if you can be educated and you have, you know, a master's and you have a PhD, you are nothing but a qualified slave under settler colonialism. You know, it doesn't matter if you are a millionaire or a billionaire, you know, under settler colonialism, you are nothing but a slave, because it is white people who have created you. That wealth which you have is nothing but, you know, imali which you have received from the very same white system. It doesn't matter if you are a famous person, you are a celebrity, you are on TV, you are a politician, you are nothing but a slave. And this is demonstrated by the fact that our politicians report to Lisbon, they report to London, they report to Washington. You know, all of the politicians, those born in the African continent, the so-called African leaders, you see. So it doesn't matter. The issue here is that we are oppressed as a collective group at different degrees or at varying degrees, you see. I think for me, Biko, there's a quote that I'm going to read, Biko, you know, and I think for me it sums up somehow Biko's ideas and the ideas of Black consciousness around this question of class and so forth. Because I think that they were more concerned about the ideas of justice, you know, and equality and a human society. Because if you take this question of Marxism and classless societies and so forth, in our African history, we have never had such a thing as a so-called classless society, because hierarchies exist from the moment you are born. From the moment you are born, you belong to a lower class than your mother and your father, you know, and so forth. Then they are, you know, of the higher class because they are your parents, they give birth to you. So what I'm saying for me is that, you know, hierarchies in society have always existed, you know, and you have always had people who are, you know, perhaps well off in terms of monetary and so forth and social status. But the issue here is that in our African societies, we did not have injustice and inequality. You did not have hunger. You did not have men and women who sleep on a tin shack, you know, something which white people's dogs don't even sleep in a tin shack today. A white person's dog sleeps inside. But Ama Africa, black people, black men and women raise children in tin shacks, you know, and this is the questions that Biko were concerned about. The questions of justice, equity, equality, humanity, you know, and the fact that our African societies, we wanted to restore, and Biko said that you will want to give to South Africa a more human face. He was speaking about the restoration of this humanness, you know, the fact that you can have people at different, you know, existing at different levels in society, but the issue of how you treat the next person as a human being, the fact that you can't have a neighbor sleeping, you know, on an empty stomach while you are having a feast, you know, and feasting all alone there, while your neighbor and your neighbor's children are, you see, bare feet, buttocks outside, and you are busy when are well fed and so forth, you see. So these are the issues that we were concerned about. And I would like to say, Africa, that this idea of classless societies is an elusive idea because it does not exist anywhere in the world. It has never existed even in Germany, where Karl Marx was born, does not exist in Russia, does not exist in China, does not exist in Cuba, or in any of the so-called communist countries. So this is just an elusive idea, You see,
Yeah.
and we must not focus on these ideas, but focus on the issue of liberating Black people, you see, as a collective, and restoring, you know, our just and humane society, as Biko said.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Khotman. And I think it's also important that we raise another difference, ne? So, okay, something that looks like a difference, which may not necessarily be a difference, ne? People say when Black people are remaining poor because they are busy with, you know, white religion, Christianity, you know, and when you look at now how Black consciousness, you know, made the contributions that it made, you know, towards us understanding a Black theology, you know, understanding what they call contextual theology or liberation theology. So do you think that Black theology, do you think it would at least lead us to a direction that we so want to be in, would at least lead us to a meaningful direction? Because that's what, I think that's the whole point of Black consciousness, you know. Biko was not talking about something that is perfect, or, you know, because our conditions are not always cute or perfect, you know. It says, Biko Guti, if Black people are angry, you know, you don't have to, you know, you must just channel that anger towards a meaningful direction. You must not stop them when they are angry, but channel their anger towards a meaningful direction. So when you look at now, like with you know, Black theology and stuff, do you think that Black theology has that potential, you know, to lead us in a meaningful direction, you know, apart from classical Christianity, you know?
Yeah. Okay. Hey. Bazawuthi sinochuku ke egconeni, you know. Nochuku, because abantu abamnyama bayakuthanda uYesu wabo omhlophe. Yeah, they will kill you for their Jesus, you know. You know.
True.
Yeah. So, and we must understand also. You see, Black consciousness is also an acknowledgement of the damaged psychological state of Black people. You see, that's what Black consciousness also teaches us. As we become its practitioners, its protagonists, at least from the perspective of Obiko, is that one of the things why Obiko were so successful in the project, Black consciousness, was that in the way that they treated Black people, right? Obiko did not project themselves as people who have a monopoly over truth. You see, even when they thought Abantu were not seeing what they were seeing. So in the way that they communicated some of the things that they discovered as truth, they found a way, you know, of not alienating Abantu abamnyama, you know, and not bashing them on the head and saying, you know, you are you are a coon, you are a Negropian. And so one of the things that Obiko did, Obiko went to the Shibins, Biko himself, and they engaged Abantu abamnyama in dialogue as part of the program of conscientization. Nabantu who were not drinking alcohol in the BC movement were going to Shibins and sitting with people who are drunk or drinking alcohol as part and parcel of the project, conscientization. So one of the things you learn is that they teach something which is very important, that if you want to effect revolutionary change, it is important for you to understand where the mindset or the level of consciousness of the people are that you want to be part of this project. So often the mistake that Abantu make who are in the radical world, I'll use that expression, that formulation, when they discover an idea, you know, when they discover Afro-pessimism, or when they discover Marxism, or when they discover Black radical feminism, the way they treat other Black people who have not come into contact with those ideas is sometimes counterproductive and alienating, you know. And you forget that there was a point in time where you did not know about BC, Pan-Africanism, Afro-pessimism, or Marxism, right? So, and this speaks to the sincerity and the humility that Juanini spoke about earlier, right? So that's the first point. The second, especially the concept of theology, right? Black theology is nothing else, right, but Christianity that is painted black. I don't want to waste your time and want to refer you to text. Black theology is nothing else but Christianity that is painted black. Black theology does not depart from the fundamental tenets of Christianity as designed by the Nicene Council, right? That gave birth to Christianity as we know it today. Precepts Zayo, as is into that Juanini spoke about, that body that took the decision of God the Mother, God the Father, and to design Christianity as we know it today. Black theology does not depart from that, you know. And so, and my problem with it is that, you see, Black theology continues to trap Black people in religion. You see, when Black people are the ones who invented spirituality, something that is above and more powerful than religion, you know. So religion comes from an external source, and spirituality is something that comes from you internally. It's something that's generated internally, you know. So there's no external power that has a power over you and your life. So there are those types of things, but again, it is how you communicate and make Black people understand the point that Juanini said. For instance, just take the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are a plagiarization of the 42 laws of Ma'at that are over 2,000 years old, that are found in one of the books called the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Christian cross is a plagiarization of the Ankh, which I showed earlier. You know, the headgear that you see the Catholic bishops and Anglican bishops wearing, you know, is a plagiarization of the Egyptian or the Kemetic deities, you know. So one of the things that Black theology does not do, Black theology creates the impression that there is something authentic about Christianity, and all that we need to do is to tamper with certain aspects of Christianity and put to Black people as Black theology, you know. So white people did not invent deities, which people today call gods, you know. We invented deities as African people. So there is no way that white people who came thousands of years after us can come and teach us theology. Theology is not even the beginning of the story, you know. But again, it depends how you communicate that when you speak to other Black people, because like I said, our people, through the system of white supremacy racism, have internalized the notion of religion, and especially Christianity, and the notion of this white Jesus as central to Christianity. So again, it depends how you engage them in the discussion to show them that it's not necessarily going to lead us to liberation, you know. I don't think it is. So we must have a deeper discussion around that aspect, Black theology, because Black theology is not African spirituality, in my view. Kamako.
Butano.
White theology. Yes, my brother.
I think like
All right. No, I was saying that white religion, you know, is a cultural instrument of oppression and dispossession. You know, it is through white religion that white people have oppressed us mentally and spiritually and dispossessed us, you see, of our culture and our spirituality. You see, it is through this religion. And I'm saying it, whether you call it a white theology or a black theology, if it is still centered around the Nicene Conference and these concepts, you know, that were derived by Abo Constantinople and so forth, if you are still stuck there and in this idea that the Bible is a holy book, whereas the Bible was written and plagiarized by people who were criminals and murderers and rapists and pedophiles, such as King James, for example. People read the King James version of the Bible and they don't know that King James was a pedophile who sodomized and raped young children, young boys to be specific as well. And so you can't, how can God, you know, allow for a pedophile to have, you know, to be the editor, the main editor of the book that you read in all of these church institutions, Mafrika? So it's important that we understand that Christianity is a cultural instrument, just like Islam, you know, and the Quran are cultural instruments of oppression. We black people were oppressed in the name of Jesus and the Bible. You know, our land was stolen in the name of Jesus and the Bible. It's the same with Africa up north, in those countries up north that are dominated by, you know, Muslims and the Islamic religion. They used the Quran and they used Muhammad and, you know, and their discourse of Islam to dispossess our people, but also to strip us off of our culture. That is why when you go to Egypt today, you will not learn about the value systems and the principles, you know, of our ancient black ancestors in Kemet, because the Arabs are now dominating in Egypt, dominating in Tunisia, Algeria, right going in through certain parts of Ethiopia. You've got these Arab settlers who are now dominating there, and they have actually erased and destroyed most of the evidence of African culture there, which is why when people take tours to go to Egypt, for example, they will not learn anything that connects the Egyptian civilization to black spirituality or, you know, to black culture or our African culture. So for me, what Biko did in the 70s and in constructing black theology, it was not meant to be a destination, but it was just part of the journey towards self-realization. So the issues that Africa Veli mentions about the concepts, like which I also mentioned earlier, of the Holy Trinity. The concept of the Trinity existed thousands of years before the Christian religion existed, before there was even a European in existence. There was no Europe. There was no white man in the world when Africans in ancient Kemet conceived the Trinity. And this Trinity, it was Osa, Oset, and their son or their child, Uheru, which the Greeks call Osiris, Isis, and Horus, you know. And it is also, when you speak about, for example, in Christianity, they talk about the concept of an immaculate conception, to say that Jesus Christ was born of a Virgin Mary. This concept predates the Bible. It predates Christianity by thousands of years, because it was Queen Isis who gave birth to the child, you know, Uheru, out after Osiris. The story is told actually in the book that Africa Veli mentioned. It's called the Ethiopian Book of Coming Forth by Day and Night. But these Greeks and these white people, they call it the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It is told in that book the story of how the Queen Mother Isis gave birth to an immaculate conception of the child, Heru, after Osiris's body was dismembered by Uset. Uset is the person in the Bible they call Satan, you know, in the Bible, who dismembered his brother, brother, and threw his body into the sea. And it was the wife, Queen Isis, who collected it together, and he took the specific organ, which is the male organ, the phallus, and put it, and it is through that dismembered male phallus that the child was born. Uheru was born on the 25th of December. But even there, these are only nothing but spiritual concepts, and these are allegories that are meant to teach us and educate us about faculties that exist in our minds, my brothers, you see. So, and there are many other issues that they teach about in Christianity, issues of resurrection and so forth. I've just mentioned that Osiris or Osa, he was killed by your brother Wake. He was the first resurrection because he was resurrected after 3 days by your Queen Isis, you see. So the concepts of religion and spirituality that were taught in the Western world, the philosophical concepts and mathematical concepts, all of these things originated in Africa, you know. And it is important then when we speak of Black theology that we don't only, you know, locate it within the Bible, but take it to its final conclusion. We must read the books of Dr. Ben Yochanan, you see, which speak about the African origin of all the world major religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. You can even go to the others, Buddhism, Krishna, and so forth. All of these have their origin in Africa. And it is this which the Black consciousness movement must teach today in taking Black theology forward.
Okay, thank you so much, Khotmans. So since now there's Ulebu, Lebu Mafabatu, and Benedict Mbiti. Lebu Mafabatu is actually finance officer, and Benedict is coordinator for Ulwando. Ulwando is our mentorship program for high school learners. So it deals with social consciousness, because we did not want to go there, you know, explicitly talking about izinto political. So we just said Kuti Ulwando will focus on social consciousness, you know, and trying to awaken the learners to understand, you know, how society is and how society was built. So, and to also understand their role in society, because a lot of learners, they go to school and they don't even see that as a role they are playing in society, you know, going to school, you know, and they don't even see the school as an institution. Yeah, but so I don't know if Andile, Comrade Andile, do you have a question? Lebu, Benedict. Comrades, Lebu. Okay.
No, leader, man, I have no question. The crisis is that I have been coming on and off with the network, so I could not grasp a lot of information. Therefore, I cannot ask a question that that I have no basis of it.
Okay, sharp. Benedict, do you have a question? Is Benedict still there?
No, leader. I'm clear, leader.
Okay, sharp. Okay, like actually, actually in Black Space now recently, we've been talking about, you know, trying to think about the township, you know, and one characterization of the township that you have made is that the township is a site of violence, you know, it is an expression of social death. If we understand that the social death is our vulnerability to violence, you know, and that kinlessness, you know, because the violence of anti-Blackness, the violence of the township does not really care who's your mother, who's your father, okanye uhlobene nabani, you know, there's that kinlessness that comes with the violence of anti-Blackness. So, and one of the things that we've been talking about was, you know, for all this violence, you know, to end in the township and for us to begin a process of healing, because I think that's the major issue here. There's never a time, you know, the violence in the township does not afford us, you know, enough time to heal, you know, even when we think of escaping the township, because a lot of people talk about escaping the township and going to the suburbs, you know, it's all cool. But these are the same people who, you know, on the weekends, they tend to go back to the township. So there's not, you know, the break, you know, is not there. And also, like, these are the people who always want to overcompensate for what they did not have or what they lost while they were in the township. You know, you find them buying all these things that are unnecessary, or are you going all out, you know, to overcompensate for a loss that they experienced while they were in the township. So it becomes difficult for them to heal. So the only way to get rid of the violence in the township that makes even an escape impossible, because it follows you everywhere you go. So is to end the township. So what do you think about that? You know, ending the township. Yeah, is it should we only think about it figuratively, or could it be a literal thing to say that yes, we are ending the township?
Well, it's not an easy one again, but the way I understand it, right? Our problems do not necessarily the essence of our problems do not necessarily have to do with the implication of the township being a site of violence, you know, and even the artificial notion of that you can escape the violence of the township, right? You see, the township is just a microcosm of the oven of violence, which is the anti-Black world. You know, so you must understand the township as a product of the anti-Black nature of the world. You understand? So, and if you understand that, you will then realize that there's no such thing as escaping the township. If you understand the township as a product of the anti-Black nature of the world, right? Which also means Sandton is as deadly and as violent for a Black body as Alexander is. So there's a false sense of security that the site of violence is the township, you know, and you did not say it, I'm just stretching it, I am stretching it. The site of violence is the township, you know, and so it might also just imply in the mind of somebody else that Sandton is not a site of violence, you know. And so the point is to understand that there is no escape if the nature or the source of your reality of social death is the anti-Black nature of the world. That there's really no escape, because the escape is artificial. But also the escape, if the escape is to move from the township to the suburb, you know, that escape is artificial on a number of respects. The other respect on which it is artificial is that it is defined in terms of a wide value system, you know, that if you move from the township to a suburb, you are escaping from something. But also implied in that notion of that escaping, it's not what you said, it's just my own, I'm just problematizing it. Also implies that a move to the suburb is upward mobility or to some level of progress, you know. Now, if that is the mindset, this is why you find a situation where when Black people who are in the township revolt, right? The Black people who have escaped the township, quote unquote, and stay in a different zone, you know, of white violence, which is the suburb, tend to now assume the role of becoming defenders of the system and they bash these other Black people, you know, these looters, these criminals, da-da-da. And it goes back to the point that I made earlier about how the system is able to create artificial divides, you know, and differences, which undermine an important thing, which is Black solidarity. So in how you go about communicating your project that relates to the township, you must also show how the whole thing of escaping the township can become problematic because it can create these artificial differences and counter or reactionary tendencies where Black people think they have escaped, you know, see other Black people who are still in the township as part of the problem, as lazy, as violent, and as looters. And so the army must go there and deal with them, you know. So it is that type of thing that in how you communicate what you do, you should guard against, you know, because we should not fight to escape from the township, you know. We must fight to be, you know, what you would call free beings who are in charge and masters of their own destiny, particularly in the land of our ancestors, so that it shouldn't matter where you are geographically, but what should matter is whether you are in Sandton or in Alexander, are you a free being as a Black person in the true sense of the word, you know? It is just those types of things that go through my head. Sure, thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Because one of the things that we have been also discussing is settler colonialism. To say that settler colonialism, if we could see settler colonialism, the elements of settler colonialism as invasion and dispossession and gratuitous violence, you know, this excessive violence that the settler uses against the native, and also conquest, because I think that we take it for granted we were conquered, you know, and yes, we try to resist, you know, the dispossession, the violence and the conquest, but we eventually conquered. So I think as colonial subjects in post-94 South Africa, I know, okay, in post-94 South Africa, you know, I think we take it for granted we are actually conquered, you know, colonial subjects, you know.
Yeah.
And I think it will be difficult also. It will be a difficult task to actually, you know, start any program, you know, towards ending any form of violence in the township, in Sandton, in the world, anywhere in the world, while we are having that, you know, while we are ensnared to that, you know, conquest, you know, that feeling of loss of self, loss of being, loss of, you know, that feeling of non-ontology, you know, and, you know, especially since it is as though we embody a void and then we express this void, you know, in the real as a social death of some sort, you know, a social and political death, you know. That's why when you see, you know, Black people, you know, revolting against certain institutions, you'll see the same Black people, others, you know, revolting against you, you know, forming a counter-revolutionary act, you know, programs. And I think this is what we once spoke about some time ago, Uguti. Whenever we try to organize ourselves, you know, and have all these revolutionary programs, there'll always be, you know, counter-revolutionary, you know, acts and forces, you know. And okay, I think we have covered so much, you know, within this time and within, you know, and I really appreciate, you know, you making time to, you know, to have this dialogue with us, and also with Thando. I think he's having a problem with the network or battery or something, you know, and I really appreciate you making time. Yeah. Yeah, so basically, just to wrap up, you know, you can just tell us about the programs that you are having, you know, in Black Power Front, and some of the things that you are planning for this year, and maybe Nati, and other people here, members of People Space, would also find interest in that, so that we can know how to support, can just show solidarity.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a fundamental thing in Yenzileyo as how old is Black Space now?
We started off, we incepted Black Space in 2016. So it's like, I don't know.
Okay, it's fine. You are over 5 years old, So I'm asking that question because you see, you have done something very fundamental, and I wish all of us can learn from it. Often organizations that organize themselves along Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism sometimes behave as though they have all the answers to the problems of Black people, and they don't see the need to work with other Black organizations or Black individuals or to get them on their platforms, So the movement that I come from, we are very strong on collaboration and benefiting from one another's experiences, and this is why I have found Black Space such an attractive space, because I got the same sense in how Black Space work, that Black Space sees itself as a contributor, to the project of Black liberation, you understand, as opposed to a space where people think they have all the answers. That's at least my understanding from your body language as Black Space, and this is why I appreciate umsebenzi oniwenzayo so much. So in the Black Power Front and the other project, the Black Power Front, which is called Mutapa, we do a number of things. So because the lockdown has changed our way of working, we had to also change our method of operation. So one of the programs we had, and we had to stop it because of the lockdown, was that we had a program which was called Black Brothers United. So Black Brothers United is essentially a program where Black men get together to work on programs on how they can improve themselves as individuals and as a collective to become better Black men. But also, as part of that project here, Black Brothers United, how elderly Black men can become positive inspirations for younger Black men. So we worked with 2 schools in Gauteng as part of that project, when we had programs that we ran with our younger brothers, and we had some interaction with them through a leadership program, where we just spoke about issues of conduct and how you should mold your character to become a better Black man and a better Black person. So that is the one project that we have, which is called Black Brothers United. And then we have the Friday Afrocentric lecture series, so we run this every Friday. We are doing it in partnership with another Black consciousness organization based in Gauteng called Arise Black Child. So we do this every Friday. So tomorrow, incidentally, Ucwanini touched on it. Tomorrow, we will be focusing on one of the principal Black women leaders of the Black consciousness movement, Umama Unikiwe Machoba, Also tomorrow, the lecture is going to focus on her role and her contribution, Umama Unikiwe Machoba. So those are some of the things that we do. Then there is also something else that we are planning, and I think we spoke with Ubutundumi about it. But like I said to you initially, given the nature of some of the things that we run, allow me not to give those details, but I'm sure offline, Sizawuthetha nani about what it is that we do. And we look forward to continuing to do more collaborative work with yourselves. We work with a number of other movements as well here, Ebukhosini, the Ang Foundation, which Ucwanini represents. And I'm sure you would have noticed in the way that we were speaking, Nocwanini, we spoke like that, and the complementarity that you saw came from the fact that both as individuals, but also as movements, we are trying our best to work towards the same agenda, even though we have different organizations or movements we belong to. We don't think it should be a problem. What should matter is whether we have a shared agenda. And that's why you see we were able to speak almost in complementary fashion, because we are constantly engaged. Yeah. So yeah, thank you once again.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, since Putando is not here, Putando is a member of the Ankh Foundation, which is a foundation that aims to advance the material, intellectual, and spiritual life of African people. You can just search on Facebook, the Ankh Foundation, and he's also a member of the Afrocentric Study Group, which is an African-centered academic society which aims, to research phenomena related to Black people. So with that, if there's no one who has any questions or anything, and I think that's it. Engosi so much, Kamaku Black Power. Thank you for making time to have this conversation with us, and I think the comrades here, they've learned so much. I see Wandile has come up, so Wandile can just have those closing remarks, can just make closing remarks so that we can depart. Engosi.
Thank you, leader. Veli, and I hope one time Rastando is over somewhere and see my thank you everyone.
But usebenzisa ibhetri, akazuvela ibhetri.
Asicharge kaloku sihlala sendleleni.
Ibhetri, hayi madoda.
Veli and the comrades, I am very, very appreciative of the effort that we're putting in. We're putting into the work and educating the masses out there. It is very important that we continue talking and continue having broad conversations about topics that are happening and relating them to topics that have already been there. So I've heard someone asking me, if we want to end the townships, what about the white squatters? I don't know what he means by white squatters, or maybe it's a white township, I don't know. But I found out that there is a South African family relief project, which is doing a charity something for all of these. Well, it's only for these white squatters, because now they have this exclusively for poor whites only township of some sort. But then the question was, if we want to end the townships, then what about, the white squatters or white townships? But then my basic answer is that even in those squatters, if there is an exclusively white only squatter, then obviously then we don't even have a choice to go there. It seems as if those people so they do have what you would think of that, but maybe just 2-3 sentences, and then we're just gonna close it off.
So it reminds me of a question I used to deal with. Before that institution was called CUT, it was called TECOS, right? So in the 90s. So we had a lot of fights there with white students, physical fights, that's why I got expelled from that institution, because I did not believe that the only way you negotiate with violence is through counter-violence, So I was pushing that type of line, in one meeting about you must respond to things in the way that they present themselves. If somebody wants to kiss you, you must kiss them back. You can only give them your lips. You see, you can't give the person your ear or your nose. We are qabuza lo muntu uyakuncamisa, so you do it through the lips. So that's logical. It makes sense, right? So that's the reasoning. But now here's the thing. So I always say to Black people that if sihleli sonke singabantu abamnyama and sithetha ngengxaki zethu, right? And the discussion, the matter under discussion is Black people, right? Now, if you stand up as a black person and you ask, what about white people, right? One of the questions we must ask you, did white people ever come to you and say to you, you must ask that question on their behalf? You see? So, uphapela ntoni? Because kuphapha oko. You see? And this is why I don't respond to that question, because white people can speak for themselves, and they've been speaking for themselves for centuries. Now, we must not waste our time siphendulane ngokuphapha, yabo. If white people did not send you to come and ask that question, suyibuza lonto. And have white people ever come to you bakuxelela njengomuntu omnyama ukuthi they need our help and they want us to end their township? So where do you get that thing that white people also want black people to end their township? Back 2 million now. So nalamtu who comes for that question must be asked ukuthi udibene phi nabelungu abamthuma bambuza lento, yabo. And how did these white people know we are going to have this discussion? You know? So kuphapha, because we must also understand it just that ukuthi masiyeke nje ukuphapha man. Yabo, let's focus on our own things. And we won't learn. We won't learn until we make our people realize ukuthi bayaphapha.
That was short and brief, and thank you, Elder. And I hope that we can continue to participate in your movements and all your other engagements for black people into the black struggle. For the rest of the comrades, we are continuing to communicate on our WhatsApp and everything. And Veli is within our spaces because it's there in the WhatsApp groups as well. So maybe if you have maybe you are shy here, then you can slide in the DMs and ask him the questions that you have. Otherwise, from me, thank you very much, Veli, and I appreciate you so much.
And long live Black Space. You know, yeah.
Is related.
I just want to say one thing. You brothers must make sure that Black Space outlives you. You see, yeah, make sure that if Black Space is bigger than you, it's bigger than all of us. Make sure that movement does not die, it outlives you. Nizithobe, nisebenze kahle, nihloniphane ngale ndlela nenza ngayo. You know, be humble, show the humility that you continue to show. Make sure that you govern your egos. You know, Black Space is an important instrument of black people, and it must continue to live, and it is up to you. Kamako.
Kamako bawo. Shabule. O Brando. Yes, valela puti. Ukundumisa ngo.
Ndingakhululeka. Ayingondumi kuthetha mna ndingakhululeka but andile.
Ngakhululeka mkhulu wami, ngakhululeka.
Okay.